So if you don't wish to be recorded, say so now.
Oh,
All
I should
right.
probably say too that I'm staying at my family's place in Spain right now, and the Wi-Fi connection comes and goes. So if I all of a sudden freeze for a few moments, I apologize in advance.
Not at all. You're coming in nice and clear for this tripartite Spain, Australia, Korea session. So I guess for the benefit of the court, I mean the record, I should mention that I'm Dr. Stafford Lumsden, former KOTESOLer of long standing. I think I joined KOTESOL in, I want to say 2007, maybe. Was press ganged into the International Conference Committee like so many others, but have since left Korea, come to Australia, where I work at the Sydney Law School. And so, in addition to training, I guess, lawyers to be teachers, I'm still quite passionate, I guess, about language, and not just spoken and written language, but multimodal approaches to communication, which, if we consider, things like input hypotheses, Krashen, Swain, they're all about the input, and input for language learners can be more than just spoken and written language. So today we're going to have a little bit of a look at some of those other modes of communication other than written or spoken language, although obviously those are probably the most common and the most useful means for clear communication. We'll have a look at what multimodality and social semiotics is, and how that might apply to what happens in your classroom. So the first thing to know is that multimodality is very much linguistics. We're all applied linguists if we're teaching a language. And it came from this, what I guess in hindsight is a critical realization that words, whether spoken or written, are or really are the sole sort of architect of meaning. I used to say to my students, English is a terrible language to learn because the spoken and written word has so many shades of meaning and rules that don't always apply. Moving beyond that, we can see that there are multiple ways of making communication or making meaning. So I guess the founder of functional linguistics is Michael Halliday, who sort of came across the idea that every communicative act is a deliberate sort of coming together of different modes, and you can see it right now as I speak to you. I'm speaking to you, but I'm one of these hand speakers, and those gestures are just as important in terms of me making meaning to you as the actual words themselves. Likewise, you could argue that things like the pen that I use to write you a message might have some meaning behind it. I'm one of these sort of odd people who are a bit, say, OCD about the pens and the fountain pens. And so, when I'm writing something, meaning is extended beyond the page. And of course, nowadays, access to the internet, multimodal, multimedia, all of these things. Sort of in the late 90s, Theo van Leeuwen, who's at Sydney University or was at Sydney University, and Günter Kress published what is, I guess, the most important work in this field, reading images, which was kind of a grammar, much like using English grammar, but a grammar for the image, in that there are definitely systematic approaches to how we, as some language speakers, different languages, speaking different languages, use images as part of the way that we communicate. And this has sort of precipitated this multimodal shift. And indeed, we can sort of start talking about the various different ways that combining different modes, can help our students in classrooms. Now, when it comes to choosing a mode, if I decide I want to say something as opposed to write an email, or if I want to, accompany a letter with an image, or if I want to use emoji in a communication online, I make those choices because each mode has different affordances. There are certain things that are better at communicating ideas than others. We can add or clarify meaning by combining different modes. So the precision for complex ideas, we might write a paragraph explaining something, but we know that a diagram that accompanies that paragraph provides a lot more precision in terms of the meaning that we're able to communicate. So there are distinct strengths and weaknesses inherent to each mode that influences how effectively it can communicate specific types of information. And by combining modes, teachers can unlock some quite sort of nuanced communications and can engage students. So the idea that language is something that's isolated and that you can teach by itself is rejected by social semiotics. Instead of just concentrating on the words or just concentrating on the spoken word, it wants to analyze and take into account all of the elements of communication that are happening at the same time. And one of the amazing things about language is that we tend to have shared understandings of what all of these different things actually mean. So, if I am, let's say, if I say something, interrogative, if I am eliciting from a student, and I make a gesture, in Korea it'd be this way, right? I'd be like, come this way. Some sort of gesture is encouraging that student to produce a response. That embodied gesture adds precision and meaning. We do it all the time in language teaching. We use our hands, we clap out syllables, we count syllables, we count, steps of instructions. All of these gestures are parts of the overall communication that's more than just the spoken word or more than just the written word on the whiteboard with the instructions. It's adding meaning to what we're saying. And students need that, especially in their second language. They need as much input as possible to draw conclusions and meaning about what's going on. So this slide is the only sort of in-depth one. There won't be a test after this, but these are our key sort of definitions, for want of a better word, right? So mode and semiotic resource. Their mode, I guess, is the umbrella term for specific things, and then semiotic resources are those specific things. So if you think of a mode as a system or a channel of communication used to create and convey meaning. Written word, spoken word. Those are our two favorites. And they're the tools or the elements that we use within a mode, say, to construct and interpret meaning. Different modes include text, image, gesture, sound. So a lot of when you're playing the CD for your students, I was going to say tape, but it is 2026. It's not 1986. When you play the MP3 on the computer for your students to do a listening activity, good ELT materials will have a whole scenario. It won't be a speaker in isolation. It'll be, you'll be able to hear those extra linguistic cues behind. The sound of the cafe, the sound of things clinking, cups and such. These are all modes, additional forms of communicating what's going on in that scene. And sometimes getting students to concentrate on those first, eliciting from them, just listen, don't worry about the language, just listen to the background. Where do you think this interaction is happening? Where are the speakers? What are they doing? Based on what you hear is really useful in terms of activating students' schema about the situation that they're going to start learning about, and eventually, will be able to communicate when they find themselves in the same situation at a later date. Mode as a way of facilitating communication by using different sensory or expressive means. So one of my colleagues, while I was finishing off my PhD here in Sydney, was also studying the idea of multimodality, but her whole shtick was not only embodied semiotics, so movement, but the social semiotics of dance. So whenever I see, different sensory or expressive means, I immediately think of dance. But of course, seeing and hearing are sensory. A lot of work is going on at the moment about the semiotics of touch and the ability to transmit tactile sensations across the internet. If you think about it, that might actually be one of the oldest modes of communication, touch, or at least one of the first that we experience as human beings when our mothers, hold us or hold our hands or pat our heads. So, while I again am quite fascinated that people are out there studying what is the meaning of these dances, the idea of embodied communication and gesture and all of these and touch is actually quite fascinating. But it's this number 5 here is probably where English teachers are most involved. And this is because the modes that we choose to communicate with, they determine the general form of communication. And language teachers and language learners, they're going to be visual and auditory. They're going to be listening, reading, speaking, and writing. And all of those, do have a potential to shape meaning. There was a study, I think, a couple of years ago where learners were given the same text. One group listened to a recording of 2 speakers. Another group read a transcript of a conversation. And while they had similar understandings of what was happening in the conversation, there were distinct sort of shades of meaning that students came away with depending on the mode in which they had experienced that conversation as language learners. And of course, you probably know that different modes have different affordances, as we've got different strengths, different limitations for expressing meaning. And my particular area, when it comes to all of this, is the semiotics of online instruction. So what affordances can we take advantage of when we are training language teachers online? What are the limitations? Obviously, there are quite a few limitations to teaching online compared to in a classroom, but there are also some strengths that perhaps students don't necessarily get to take advantage of when they're in your classroom. They only have 50 minutes of English instruction a week or whatever. So the affordances of the different resources we use determine how effectively we're able to communicate. Now, having said that, I was a online teacher once upon a time, I guess I should take this opportunity to stop, and I won't use any eliciting or concept checking questions, but I wonder what kinds of or let me put it this way: what modes do you think are the most common in your classrooms? So take 10 seconds, then turn your microphone on and just shout them out. What are the most common modes in your classroom?
Oral, visual. I think visual, like with gesture and images, make a lot of use of that. And then oral, of course, speaking, eliciting, that kind of stuff.
Oh,
Print text for me. Did you say images too, Chris? I think you
Yeah.
said that.
yeah, I think oh, we've got someone else here. Hi, Andrew. Not sure whether it's just a black shape. Just Andrew. Hi. I yeah, look, I think most of us are enamored by images. Our learners certainly are, and they go a long way to help, again, sort of before you jump into an activity or before you introduce even a new piece of language. You might start by showing students an image, to activate schema. You might get your students to create an image at the end to check their understanding of whatever that new piece of language is. Um, you know, don't be shy to use the whiteboard to draw images, pictures, diagrams, flowcharts, step by step with arrows. The arrows are just as important as the language sometimes. Okay. So if we think about a communicative act, right? That's I guess the ultimate outcome for us as teachers, our students, is that we want them to communicate. But communication has an anatomy. There are different parts, different bits doing different things at different times or at the same time in a single communicative act. But here is the kind of example that is really the basis of where I sit in all of this. Here is the announcement page of my online course for week 3, and we have our sort of linguistic semiotic resources: vocabulary, grammar, syntax, words, all very useful in and of themselves. They communicate important information. And indeed, look, I mean, if you think about some students online, that's all they can use. Students with access issues, maybe visual impairment, all they need is black on white and they're done. But there are other non-linguistic semiotic resources that, again, can be added that start to help us make our communications more precise. Things like typography, right? Bold and italics and font choice, again, going back to the idea of being a little bit obsessed with pens, I'm exactly the same with fonts and spacing, and making sure that things appear on a page in the right place, because they all speak to the ultimate meaning that I'm trying to make for my students. A lot of time in my most recent publication on training using multimodal methods is about thinking about, using lists. A list tells you or tells our students a lot, beyond just, these are the words maybe you need to learn for this week's class. A list signifies something. A list signifies that these are important things in this list. If you can go as far as to say, if you just use regular bullet points versus colored arrow-shaped bullet points, to bring more emphasis or more attention to a specific list. I mean, you can get very, very granular about these things, but in doing so, you are thinking about how you are communicating the meaning that you want to get across to your students. So semiotic resources are kind of the building blocks that we put together to create messages. And we do that in all modes. So whether it's spoken, written, online, gesture, and the person receiving that act then pulls apart all of those little pieces to try and interpret and understand them. And all of those little pieces are culturally and socially defined. So one of the strangest things when I came back to Australia was that I would usually say that the list here is a series of bullet points. The role of context in communication, analyzing, blah, 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 blah. Those are bullet points. But in Australia, they're called dot points. And I was like, why? What? No, they're bullet points. They're not dot points. What's a dot point? And I still haven't gotten to the end of it, but it's more than just, you hear about American and English spelling, or an American calls it the trunk, an Englishman calls it the boot on the back of the car. It's something more than that. I think sort of in the late 90s, Australia had something of a gun problem, and there was a bit of an issue calling things bullet points. And culturally, or societally at least, everyone just decided, yeah, we're not going to call them bullet points anymore. So when you say bullet point, you're communicating something about yourself. It's very interesting, and one of those things that I need to look into further. But all of that is to say that every communicative act that you undertake in your classroom has got lots of little bits of those little building blocks, all of which contribute to meaning. And sometimes our students pull those apart and they have a different understanding of what our intended meaning was. So, what I want to do in this, I guess, middle part, second part, is just this is probably the most useful part, is to think about, how does this all apply to an actual language classroom in Korea? Having a little bit of experience of classrooms in Korea, although I realize it's getting close to 9 years since I last was in a Korean classroom. But as an indication, Chris, you're at a high school, yeah?
Yes, I am.
Ah, fantastic. And Brian, what's your teaching sort of context?
I'm currently at an international high school working
Oh,
with
okay.
secondary students.
Okay. So I think a lot of people would be like, let's skip over elementary then. But no, elementary is the best one. And indeed, these are all things that I used to do with adults. Because there is they're sort of fundamental in some ways. So we've talked about dance and we've talked about gesture, and TPR, or total physical response, is this way of sort of tapping into young learners, kids' sort of propensity for movement and stuff. But there's also a very deep physiological connection between movement and memory. right? So if you ever see a Shakespearean actor who's learning their lines for the first time, Shakespearean actors all come from the same sort of training. They all do weird movements with their hands as they start to learn their lines because there is that connection between physical movement and memory. And while that in itself is interesting, one of the things we'll get students at this level to do is mime out the actions as they're doing it. So there's double the usefulness in a TPR approach. Not only is there the physiological movement equals memory, but there's also the gestures that communicate what the students are talking about. So even if they don't get it, they're just kids, the gesture, well, they should be able to relate it back to their own lives. Storybooks, again, fantastic when thinking about visual meaning. And again, starting, if you have a reading lesson, and again, even if you're doing it with high school kids, university kids, or adults, starting off the lesson with an image based on the reading that you're about to undertake in that lesson, just eliciting from students, what do they see, what do they think is happening, all of those sorts of things. A use of image to imbue meaning in what students are about to say. Not to mention the fact that, again, even adults love to sort of sketch out things in the margins. That's their way of making meaning out of what they're hearing or seeing or whatever, and that's something that can be tapped into as well, encouraging learners to create their own multimodal texts, if you will. And obviously, having students storyboard out something or create their own storybooks is a time-honored tradition in all good Friday afternoon ELT classrooms. And again, sort of circling back to embodied action, having students act out stories that they've just heard to check their understanding, giving them roles to undertake, so that maybe it's as part of a closed listening, giving them the role. They have to listen and then be that person in a reenactment. And again, all things that can be used with not only elementary school but adults as well. When we get to the higher levels, obviously there's some benefit in rationalizing things, but also sort of grounding things in the real world, right? So giving your students the opportunity to dissect some media of some description. And thank goodness for YouTube. I don't know what I would have done without YouTube as a language teacher once upon a time, but showing students stuff that they may not always get access to, ads from Australian television or American television or Canadian television, and getting them to explore how the English is used in those ads. And what do they see and what do they think it means? And you start building on it, it becomes more storytelling. Would you buy this? What would you do with it? All based on some media dissection. Maybe sort of more university or later high school, thinking about transfer. So I think Korea invented like online influencers, right? So it shouldn't be so much of a weird one for students in Korea. But I know I was talking to a friend the other day actually, who's just back in Australia after teaching in China for a couple of years, and their ability to sort of do something in, I guess, Mandarin first, and then sort of critically apply that same thinking to what they're doing in English. He said was never seen it in the other places that he'd taught. So getting students to build on their first language skills in their second language is kind of more of a meta kind of thing. But the key here is getting them to explain it, right? And again, that can be through whatever mode is available. And then again, thinking more about teenagers who love to express themselves, or who may find it a bit difficult, actually, or a bit embarrassing, or a bit, there's that whole affective kind of barrier with a certain cohort of sort of 15-year-old boys and girls who just want to sit at the back and not do anything, not because they're, you know, crappy students, but because they are nervous or embarrassed or whatever. Um, you know, asking them to express themselves or to express understanding of what you've just done in English in their classroom in other modes. They don't have to talk all of the time. They don't have to, they don't have to stand up and, yell back the conversation that they have memorized. They can show their understanding by organizing, things in order on the table. They can create an image. They can create blog posts. They can write in HTML or Java or whatever as they get older, and as you might find sort of things that apply to their context. Which is to say, all of these are about getting students to critically engage with real examples of English language, right? So I haven't said it as of yet, but I'm going to say it now. With the artificial intelligence, we all have to be really on top of developing our students' critical thinking and critical engagement with what they're seeing in front of them. And at no time in the past has this been more important than now with generative AI. But if you are helping your students understand that it's more than just the text, or it's more than just the image that they see online or wherever, if they can critically engage with it and identify the building blocks that have come together to create that image or that text, then they're able to say, oh, well, no, that's created by AI. That's rubbish. That's not real. If you've reached that point with your students, then they should be able to do the same with their own writing, for example, their own composition, their own speaking, right? So multimodality and social semiotics, there is a lot of metacognitive stuff here, right? But it informs understanding of discrete systems like a language. If students can have an awareness or an understanding of what are those little building blocks that come together to form a sentence, then they're already most of the way there to understanding, these are the little building blocks that come together to communicate. Finally, if you've had the pleasure of teaching adults, like I have once upon a time, I guess the main thing is making it as real as possible. Generally, adults come into an English language classroom with a very specific goal, and it's very, very oriented towards what they are actually doing in their lives outside of the classroom, right? So I know this because I've just had my brother-in-law here from Korea for a year. He's just returned to Korea last week. He was here in Australia learning English. Making it as close to their real lives as possible. And, for me, that was always, okay, let's open our textbooks to the first page of chapter blah. Okay, this is the topic. Now, how does this apply to what you're doing? And kind of moving quite far away from the textbook, because it's a good starter, but perhaps a little inauthentic. So in terms of what our adult and continuing education students are doing, getting them to do the things that they're actually there to do, create presentations, think about the use of language in the context of business and how it's more important than, just specific correct English grammar. There's more to it, building their digital literacies, again, from what I remember, not the most difficult thing in Korea. Everyone is reasonably switched on when it comes to being online and using computers and all of that sort of stuff. It was always quite fun when someone, apparently got swindled out of some money or something online in Korea because everyone's so digitally literate. And so preparing adults for a landscape where increasingly communication is more than just words on the page, or it's more than just being able to say the lines that they've memorized, means that they need to be able to deal with images, deal with other modes of communication in different genres, reports, emails, presentations, and so on. So mastering those forms of English requires leveraging, a huge number of social semiotic resources all at the same time. And it's totally fine if people want to concentrate on them one at a time, or sequentially, or randomly, or whatever suits your learning context or your students' learning context and your teaching context, as long as everyone is on the same page when it comes to understanding that it's more than just, well, in the famous words of the philosopher Clapton, it's more than just words, right? Um, so yes, and you'll see, I mean, even this evening, in the choice of sort of the style of my slides here, there are some distinct social semiotic choices I've made here, mostly because I like the aesthetic, the sort of the 1950s kind of instructional field guide kind of look of things. But in doing so, would I have done this if I was giving this discussion to, I don't know, second year university students? I'd probably choose something else, because even the style is communicating something to you as the audience about, how I view all of this stuff. So, look, I mean, before we wrap up, and hopefully there'll be a couple of questions before we round things up. I've touched on this, that nowadays very much a blurring of the boundaries. If you go back to the first edition of Reading Images by Kress and Van Leeuwen, it's a lot of magazine ads do this, and newspapers do this, and there are, column inches, and, we look at a page like a flagpole. Nowadays, our learners do not. I think one of the most important sort of studies to come out of social semiotics of late has been, eye tracking studies, where they clip on, actually, they don't even need to clip on giant glasses anymore. They just put on like a Meta, Apple thing, because it tracks your eyes, right? And whether it's a result of the huge amounts of TikTok that our students imbibe, they don't read normally anymore. It's terrible to say normally, but for 100 odd years, academia has said, yeah, look, we read this way. We read down the page, and then we read left to right. And if you're an Arabic speaker, or if you speak language that goes from right to left, it's the inverse. This, and increasingly, we have students and it's not like there's a theme or there's consistency across samples. It's totally random. And if you ever have the displeasure of opening TikTok, the first time I thought TikTok, or someone stands in front of holds their phone out and, talks for 2 minutes. Nowadays, is that person, the creator, is in the corner, and there's a temple running game going on underneath, and the words are being captioned, and all of these things are the exact social semiotic sort of things that we're talking about here. Each of those choices that creator has used to put together 2 minutes of on-screen assault, are a choice, and they're communicating things to a certain audience. So it kind of behooves us as language teachers to do the same to our students. So you need to go and if you haven't already, join TikTok or whatever the Korean equivalent is, because I imagine there's a Korean equivalent these days, and start creating in that style. Start teaching, I mean, not all of the time, obviously, but giving your students language instruction in the modes that they are used to outside of the classroom can be some of the most powerful ways for them to learn a language. It probably dates me. I was around when Kakao Talk started. And the first thing that I did was to jump on Kakao and start, because when it first became you were able to make like rooms, start just putting little bits of instruction in Kakao, get all the students into a Kakao room and give them a 20-second listening task that they could do in their own time, that they could share ideas about in that space. Now, I'm sure there's something different. Like I say, TikTok might even be a bit passé these days. Who knows with young people? But understanding the semiotic resources that your students use outside of the classroom and using them in the classroom or using them outside the classroom with your students, as it were, is a really useful way of reinforcing learning. And with artificial intelligence, at least you can automate that and you don't have to stand in front of your phone and record it yourself. You can actually make an avatar to do it on your behalf. Am I even here right now? Who knows? So I guess the boundaries between written and spoken and visual communication and oral communication, and even where things traditionally go on a page are no longer what they used to be. And understanding that and understanding that multimodality is how we address that. It's not just a theory, it's actually how we can navigate and how our students can navigate communication is a really handy tool and a handy way of sort of framing how you look at language instruction. The only other thing I would say before I wrap it up is that for a lot of this, there's no consensus yet. Krashen critical period is still debated. So there's a good cause that this might be debated 20 years from now as well. But what has sort of annoyed me throughout all of my journey in multimodality is that no one will agree what multimodality in TESOL actually is. Is it a teaching approach, or is it just what the students are able to produce in terms of language, or is it both? I'm of a mind that it's both. You've both got to plan teaching as a communicative act with a multimodal lens. So you want to use as many different modes as possible to activate schema, to reinforce memory, to check understanding, and have students produce language in multimodal forms. Other thinkers on the subject tend to think it's just, students can write, they can read, they can marry images with text, they can create a blog post that has a nice picture, the end. We're still traditional reading, writing, speaking, listening. So there is a lack of consensus, and it is contextual, and it is probably a good example of how language or communication and culture go together. Because our understandings of certain images or signs are culturally defined, there can be sort of shifts in meaning. And of course, the good example is Konglish is the good example here, right? So it might be the same word, it might sound the same, but the culturally shared understanding of that word is slightly different between, say, a Korean native speaker and an English native speaker. The digital divide While some classrooms utilize digital whiteboards and video, and I guess again, Korea very lucky compared to some parts of the world. It isn't so much of an issue, but a lot of multimodal stuff is online, right, these days. The explosion of video, audio, and the ability to create audio and video is online. And so issues of digital divides are still with us. I thought we would have solved that one by now. It's 2026. Golly. The other one here, the final one that I'm perhaps not as concerned about is the idea of cultural imperialism. I remember my first job in Korea was like, oh, do you have to speak in that weird Australian New Zealand accent? Could you not speak like an American? No. With all due respect and love to my Korean American colleagues, I think with again with the ability to see and read all sorts of different dialects of English, it's not nearly as bad as it used to be in Korea. Although from what I understand, it pops up every now and again still. And that's all sort of what I said earlier about embracing multimodality as a way of navigating modern communicative teaching, as it were. So look, I will leave it there, having sort of taken up a good 45 minutes there. But I wonder, does that make sense? Probably, some of the pictures may aid your understanding of this, but it's been a while since I've had a live audience as well. I've been writing a lot about this recently, so any comments or questions would be gratefully received. And of course, if we have a nice long silence here, Chris will edit it out before posting any videos.
So I think the first thing is we got a small crowd here, but a warm round of applause, I think, is justified. So thank you for your efforts. I myself have a lot of questions. I don't want to give like too many, of course. Brian has a few, but I think I'll kick things off and then let Brian follow up on that. I guess I'll go with maybe two or three here, and then we'll shift to Brian if he's got a few. So I'm wondering here how you fit these. I think I get the big picture, and it made me think a little bit about my teaching. For example, I'm always thinking I'm teaching high schoolers. I'm always thinking, how can I sort of connect? How can I relate to them? So, I do use AI to make like images, and I often put them in like a Korean webtoon format. So I'm kind of making a rhetorical, multimodal kind of choice when I'm doing that. I'm trying to literally communicate in a visual grammar that learners can use. So it did make me connect more to this. What I'm doing is essentially applying a type of multimodality, but I'm not always consciously using those labels. So I do want to talk a little bit about labels to help it just what's the academic, kind of way to categorize these in your expert opinion, Stafford. So like for example, you talk about
Expert.
using yes. You talked about using like a pen and stuff. You're big on fountain pens, you're talking about like bullet points. How those do kind of communicate something, and they do. They say, well, this is important. You really need to pay attention to this. So specifically, I got three things here. Space. Would you categorize? I'm assuming you would. Space. I'm thinking about how I set up the desk in my classroom. That would fall into some kind of multimodality label. And so also, so space, the pins you talked about, using objects, and using the first or second language itself. Do these all fall into sort of, because part of me is hearing this multimodality, it seems kind of like really discrete, like you've got a visual channel, you've got a oral channel, you've got written, and so like these things all fall in this big multimodality category. Like, I'm thinking specifically the fountain pen, the way you arrange your desk, so you use space, students in their second language. Is there a kind of nice little multimodal label that separates these things? Do they all fall into similar categories? How would you categorize those things?
Okay. So sort of going back to the first point about taking text, ideas, whatever, and sort of transforming them into webtoon format, right? That is probably a good example of your understanding of different genre, right? And genre is, for want of a better way of putting it, pretty much like we think it is initially, horror, romance, comedy, whatever. Different forms have different characteristics. We use specific semiotic resources in different genres, right? So by way of an example, if I am, in your example, the web toon, it might have an emoji in there somewhere, and that emoji might substitute actual written language, because that emoji is, it encapsulates an idea, and you as the author have an understanding of what it means, and the reader has an understanding, a shared understanding of what it means. And so you've communicated that concept. You wouldn't necessarily put an emoji in, say, an application to the court. In fact, it would stand out considerably. It would be inappropriate to use an emoji in a court filing, say. So the choice of that semiotic resource, the emoji, is genre dependent. Essentially, every time we communicate something, we are putting together all of those semiotic resources, and we are usually communicating in a single mode. So right now, or a dominant mode. So right now, the dominant mode is spoken. I'm talking to you, but my meaning is conveyed through my screen and the slides, in addition to my speaking, and my strange hand movement. The way that I am attempting to not look at my slides, but actually look at the camera, tells you something about how I'm approaching this communicative act. The very choice of Zoom has something to do with the mode of what's happening here, and communicates meaning. Why don't we use MS Teams? What does that communicate? It's perhaps going a little bit granular. So awareness of these different building blocks that go together to create meaning. Again, it's more than just the spoken word right now as we speak. There are 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different things going on all at once. Space is an interesting one, and it's actually the whole reason why I got into social semiotics. In the early 2000s, Gunter Kress did a longitudinal study of English classrooms in England, and specifically about how the teachers used the spaces to get their students to actually engage with the language. So and as people who teach at high schools, you'll know that it's very difficult to utilize your space sometimes. The accepted way of learning in Korea, teaching and learning in Korea, is for students to be in rows, sitting at their desks, facing the board at the front of the room, which again communicates something about education in Korea. I mean, it's been the same in the West for hundreds of years as well, so no shade on Korea. So getting students up and moving around the classroom and doing different things in different parts of the classroom. So a lot of the teachers would have students in groups, and they had a space, a corner, 4 groups, 4 corners. That was their home space, but they did certain communicative acts in certain different parts of the classroom. Their progress was recorded in different parts of the classroom using different, big stickers or check marks or posters, all of these different modes again, or different resources again, to create an overall sort of English space, if you will. And it's fascinating thinking about how these teachers went about what it meant to be in those spaces, what it meant to the students, what it was communicating to how the students understood what it meant to be in that space to learn English. Funnily enough, The study was turned into a book. It's called English in Classrooms. Thoroughly recommended. So use the space to provide meaning to your students. I've sort of rabbited over and beyond the third part of your question.
But again, my question was, yeah, I think I generally comprehend the concept. I was asking just about labels. Is there a specific word for the label when you're using the pen? Because like spoken modality, okay, that's pretty concrete there. Visual modality, would a pen be like a visual modality? Would space be a visual modality?
Well, I guess the pen is probably not the best example because it's not so much the pen, unless I'm writing you a letter, but I'm also including a picture of me writing it with a specific pen,
Mhm.
right? With pens, it's the product of the pen is what the overall mode is. So the mode would be written,
Mhm.
it'd be text, I guess. But maybe I've chosen a particular colored ink. Maybe that says something. I wouldn't necessarily want to write a student's name in red if I was teaching in Korea, for example, right? Because that has a specific meaning, culturally shared meaning in Korea. Um, so while it's the mode is text, the additional semiotic resource is the color of the ink. If I showed you a picture of me filling up the pen with the ink and that added to what I had written in text, then that's an image is a semiotic resource. So the individual building blocks are semiotic resources. The overall mode in which you receive that communication that you have to interpret or decode, that's the mode.
Awesome. Thank you. So, Brian, do you have any questions you'd like to share?
Yeah, yeah. First, Stafford, I'm so pleased to meet you and thank you for this presentation today. I really enjoy getting back into this subject. I was first introduced to social semiotics during my graduate work, so it's wonderful to come
Cool.
back into these conversations again. So thank you. I was just thinking now about as a high school classroom teacher, I'm thinking about the concern that sometimes teachers have if they're doing maybe a reading assignment and the students are reading the text. But then if you provide images, then the images can provide information that allows the students to, in some ways, bypass the text to capture meaning. And I wonder what guidance you have from multimodality from that perspective on those kind of situations that teachers worry about.
So I guess I may have betrayed the fact that once upon a time I was a young learner TESOL teacher or TESOL teacher trainer. Um, Maybe it says something about me and that I love storybooks. Um, but yeah, no, there are some distinct I guess sort of instructional strategies here, right? So with young learners, and whether they're not sort of sure, we just want to sort of support or scaffold their understanding. Depending on the language, I guess, right? Either provide the images up front and use it as again a way to activate schema. Give them an image of what happened, of something that might happen in the text. Get them to predict it. What's going to happen in this text. Then take it away and have them just do it in a single mode, just text. Because yeah, they can get the wrong idea, right? Some meanings are shared, but slightly different between cultures. So yeah, if we're wanting to keep them on the straight and narrow, if there's a discrete language item that we're going to concentrate on, yeah, maybe we take out some of the variability by removing the image. That said, the ongoing scaffolding of an image and the connection between text and images is really strong with young learners. Maybe it's going to be a good thing that they can infer meaning between text and image. I tend to think there's a period in high school where, again, you want to take away the images. Something about physiological development of teenagers and their inability to concentrate for more than 2 minutes at a time. And then, again, maybe return the pictures after that period. Like I started off with as well, it doesn't have to be just a picture, right? Those extra linguistic cues, love them. A soundtrack to a reading can be just as powerful in terms of building short-term memory and then getting students to produce the language afterwards to sort of start building their long-term memory. And again, there's a good example of two different modes. You got the image, the visual, you got the audio. And neither of them actually have text or spoken language in them, right? But there's those language items are still in there, and they're still scaffolding and supporting students. Yeah, and look, even complex, adult sort of technical texts, sometimes, getting students to create a process chart or a flow chart is the exact visual that they need to accompany that text. So, I mean, to cut a long story short, it depends. It's entirely up to the context, and using visuals is just one of the many arrows in the proverbial quiver, if you will.
Outstanding. Thank you.
No worries. Thanks again, Chris. Small group, but I'm sure you'll edit it to make
Yeah.
it sound a much more rollicking sort of to and fro.
Okay. So I guess with that, I'd love to ask one more question, but if you're a little busy, we can bypass. It's okay?
Oh, not at all. Go ahead.
Okay. So last one here, and I promise last one. So just want to hear, could you elaborate a little bit on that study? I think you mentioned how like when learners would hear the same text, they kind of draw a little bit of a different meaning compared to the reading thing. So it makes sense, of course. I'll quickly shut up, but you'll hear tone of voice, for example, that can definitely alter the meaning, especially when you're talking about a different culture or learners from a different background. Reading the text, they may not pick up on elements of sarcasm, blah, blah, blah. So anyhow, I'm curious, what were the concrete, differences?
See, I've done myself in here. I can't remember for the life of me what the actual study was. I would have to look it up and get back to you. But of course, I mean, we've all been in a situation where we've read an email and been mortally offended by the content of that email, and then read it back again and gone, oh no, actually, it's completely neutral what this person said in the email. And then we've spoken to them on the phone, and they're the most loveliest person we've ever met, and what they've said makes complete sense. And we don't know how or why we would have ever thought differently. Um, that speaks to that thing. I swear I'm not making it up. I will look it up and I will email it to you, and by all means share it. It is somewhere, but I'm reasonably sure we've all experienced something similar, probably in our own classrooms, right? Where students have read an instruction and then we've actually said it to them. And then, the light bulbs have gone off above their heads and said it. So thank you for the homework. I will look into that and get back to you.
All right, excellent. So I guess with that, we'll wrap it up. Thank you for extended duty today, Stafford. Before you leave, just want to let everyone know, I know Stafford has plans to return to Korea. Who knows, maybe you'll be here on the state, but on September 19th, we will be having a face-to-face event. It's currently got 5 speakers. We got 2 from Indonesia, our former International Conference Chair Mirbeck, and we've got 2 presenters. KOTESOL Tech Editor Andrew White and Victor Reeser will be talking about, more practical applications of AI in a panel discussion. Perhaps I will be on that panel if I cannot locate another person. We are still looking for one other speaker. If you've got someone you would like to recommend for that, we'd love to have you. If you're available to attend, we would love that too. It's at Sukmyung, right where the international conference was. So that's my plug on that. Trying to get a social event set up in early September, but no guarantees on that. I know other teachers have university schedules and stuff, so I'm kind of waiting to pull the trigger on that one. But September 19th, Saturday, September 19th, 12 p.m. at Sukmyung. If you're available, hope to see you there. All right. So I am done.
Great.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you, everyone. This is a lot of fun. Thank you, Stafford, for the excellent presentation. And thank you, Chris,
Great
for
meeting you.
leading the
Thank you so
event.
much.
Thank you
Hope
so
to see
much.
you in Seoul sometime.
Yeah, definitely. And pay attention to
For sure.
KOTESOL.org and the chat rooms. I'll keep it updated. All right.
Will
Thank you.
do. Bye, everyone.
Fantastic. Have a good night, everyone. Bye.
Have a great evening. Bye bye.